What if every disruption, no matter how messy, could actually increase trust in your organization? My guest today, Kim Bohr, has the data to prove it. We're talking about the spark effect, trust elasticity, and how leaders can turn disruption into trust dividend instead of a disaster. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Hey, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. We are going to talk about a big subject, a word that gets thrown around easy, but isn't easy at all. We're going to talk about trust today. And I am very excited because if you talk about the Business Emergency Room, we talk about disruption and we talk about turmoil. And our guest today is a specialist in the combination of trust and disruption in business. So who better than my guest Kim Bohr to talk about this today in this episode? Kim has over 25 years leadership experience in cross-functional teams. She's the creator of SparkEffect, which is around measuring trust during disruption and managing trust during disruption, and trust elasticity, which is a fabulous term we, of course, are going to talk about. She actually runs an organization of well over 100 people deploying all this theory, right, by means of executive coaching and working with teams and organizations and boards and any and all and more. I'm sure we'll get into that too. And the best news of all, she's also a podcast host, which, maybe doctors are horrible patients, but I always love having other hosts on the podcast. So that's a lot and a lot of cool stuff. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I am just really glad we found each other because trust is an easily thrown around word, right? And it's definitely a major factor in things going wrong, but also in recovery of any kind, right? So in both breakdown and recovery, it's a major enabler. Can you talk a little bit to start us off about the why and the why now around the spark effect and why you chose that as a niche to really
focus on? Absolutely. Yeah. So when so SparkEffect itself has been around for around 40 years. And the idea has always been focused in this, leadership development space, career transition, executive coaching, CEO evaluations, all that kind of stuff. And the reality is that leadership has changed significantly over the years. And one of the things that we all are experiencing in this American business culture, at least, is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change. We're finding that just seems to be very constant. And one of the things that kept coming up through conversations was around, some kind of a conversation around trust, like trust is breaking. We're having trust issues. Things like this would come through in the conversations we were having. And we started to get really curious around disruption, around AI disruption. What was that doing? And then we started to think about, well, what is more broad disruption doing to organizations? And that prompted us to get very serious about this research. And we partnered with a PhD who's an anthropologist of work, and he's very close with us. And we crafted together this survey that we then launched because we wanted to understand what's happening inside organizations. And so that was the genesis of our first year. And the results were really, really incredible.
Yeah, and so we want to know more and all about that. But yes, I started off saying it's a much used and potentially abused word. If we talk about trust in the context of business, what is it to you, or how do you define it, or maybe what is it not? Because it also gets used maybe wider than it should. So can we talk about your definition of trust? What's included in that, or what is the concept of trust in business?
Yeah. So one of the things that we believe really strongly is that you can absolutely measure trust, because to your point, we all know intuitively, well, yes, if somebody does something that is out of line, it's going to break our trust. And it gets used very lightly. It gets used as a just kind of a dismissive and not very strategic. And we felt that it absolutely should be part of a business strategy. So we defined trust by looking at 5 dimensions that we were able to measure. And so the 5 dimensions are strategic clarity, psychological safety, relational continuity, and cultural belonging, technology and systems trust, and then fairness, change, and impact perception. And so those were the 5 domains that we used for measurement. And what we found a tremendous amount of stuff, but for the purpose of the business audience we have here, we were able to make a direct connection to real impact on revenue, reputation, and retention. And that is where it's a game changer in how we think about what does it mean to talk about trust inside our organizations.
So there's, I hear a lot around consistency there, things working, consistency in all these themes, right? Presence, transparency, a lot of, yeah.
Yeah.
And I like that it's divided up in the 5 buckets. I think like psychological safety is maybe a very one that people directly associate with this.
Mhm.
Why is systems and technology also a part of that? How does that's a more
Yeah.
intriguing one to me.
Yeah, so it's really thinking about, do employees trust how systems are being implemented? Are they being implemented for the good and the benefit of the employee? Is it explained as to why that's it's happening? We were really curious around AI being such a disruptor in all of our lives. What is that doing to trust inside organizations, as one example? So we had some isolated questions on that, and in addition to these others. And so in that case, we found that it is the biggest disruptor, but it's not the biggest trust breaker. And that was really fascinating to us. And so we felt like these things that are happening inside organizations, it really comes down to how they're handled is really what's tied to whether trust is gained or whether it's really broken.
So it's not necessarily the system itself, it's the way it's structured and what it does and how much of a black box maybe it is also. So
Yes.
again, transparency too, huh?
Yeah. So the idea of like, how did we go about bringing this system change into play? Did we actually understand what the challenges are of the workforce? Did we actually try to bring them into the process to give their feedback? It's all of those kind of steps so that when we then bring forward a solution, it doesn't feel like it's coming out of left field. It feels like it's actually a part of what people were saying needed to improve. And unfortunately, that's not how many organizations approach things like this. And that's
No.
really just, it's just, yeah, it's a huge breakdown.
Yeah, and one of the things we see in disruption, or I see in disruption a lot too, is that when things go south,
Mhm.
even leaders who are leaders or leadership that it has been historically quite transparent and open and fair, tends to do what most of us do when things go wrong in our life, which is close the doors, close the hatches, and become more sparingly with sharing, right? When the news gets bad, that's the scary thing. I think the prejudice is around disruption that I hear is that if the trust already wasn't there or was low,
Mhm.
and you then face disruption, that maybe that's that's the fatal blow. The fatal blow. But it's kind of logic that disruption where I sit is not often one crisis, right? It's a
Right.
slow buildup of a lot. So it's also logical that there's been hand in hand an erosion
Mhm.
of trust. So assuming that whatever before the descent started, there was decent or
Mhm.
yeah, above average trust. And there's been, a decline because of everything that happened. And now we're in this situation where we're like, this is not where we should be. Is there hope?
Absolutely. So you make a great point. What we wanted to understand was what type of disruption, right? And what we set out to look at was personal and professional. And we essentially said, pick all that apply. And the reality is that there are micro disruptions happening all the time, and leaders need to be equipped to understand how to handle those. Because what we found and what surprised us with this research was that if somebody or a leader or an organization made a good faith effort to do something about that disruption and address it in particular ways, the trust could actually be called what we called a trust dividend. It actually could gain, and it grew about 12% above the baseline of those who reported no disruption at all. So that's a big deal. What that told us was that you shouldn't be trying to avoid crisis, but you should be prepared, and you should be not thinking about it as a big headliner, but that it actually has to do with all these smaller things, which could include a back to work mandate that then disrupts somebody's childcare situation, or an elder care, scenario, or some other type of dynamic that's happening in the workplace. So I think part of what we want to do is help these organizations reframe what disruption looks like, and then get leaders prepared to be dealing with it on a more of a consistent, regular basis, so that that trust can build versus it just kind of continuing to chip away.
Yeah, and I used to talk about, so I talked a lot about retention of minority talent. In my case, it was about women in male-dominated industries, and there, I think it's related because I talked a lot about how all the little things that happen that are not quite okay are like pebbles in a backpack, and at some point, that backpack becomes too big. And you just can't shed that luggage, right? But restoring trust can be quite a clumsy action, right? I used to talk about how, if, like your example of the back to work mandate after giving birth, that if I then feel that I could say to somebody, hey, but we talked about this, I get it that you're doing this in the business, but it's also just been weeks, and somebody's, oh, I forgot, I'm sorry, okay, let's talk about this, we'll figure something out. Even if it's that, it's a clumsy-ish solution. That's a trust restorer because it shows care, right?
Definitely. And that was one of the big pieces, right? Empathy and care are huge. People aren't expecting leaders to be perfect. They are expecting to act in good faith, into thinking about, how can we, how can I be seen and heard? So like, how can you understand my perspective? Like just being curious, well-intended, that's what people are expecting. And, even if it's a bit clumsy, if it's done in good faith, there's that ability to gain on the trust. It's when it's following the company line. It's when we're told to just say, this is what you're going to say, and you're not adapting it to what your team needs, or you're not thinking about that way, that it absolutely will fail miserably.
Yeah. Okay. If we talk about people and personalities and types, right? If I look at the type of industries I work with, there's many of them that are quite technical oriented, that are fast paced, fast moving. Typically, I know it's generalizing, but typically there's a lot of people in there who are not outwardly very high on the empathy and the emotional and personal engagement scale, right? And sometimes because they're very introverted people, so for all sorts of reasons. I don't claim that they are not like that, but that's not what you see of many of these individuals or leaders in the workplace. Is that directly, if I'm a more introverted, techie, nerdy, straightforward, very factual oriented leader, does that make it harder for me to be a trusted leader?
I don't know if it's harder to be a trusted leader. I do think it's some additional skill building. So many leaders in general can be promoted because of technical expertise. And then we get into these situations where other types of capabilities are needed, and we don't always have those already built in because we were not invested in that way. And so I think that it is certainly an area where there's more opportunity for some of these capabilities to be built in. And I think it doesn't mean it can't, certainly doesn't mean it can't be done. But that opportunity to build trust, maybe it takes you a little bit longer, or maybe you need to recognize I need to be open for someone to point out to me that I'm missing connecting these dots But if I'm doing that in good faith and I'm receptive when somebody points it out to me, that's a trust building opportunity. And so I don't think it has to be, it shouldn't be somebody thinking, well, I just don't, that's not my thing. It's just about more being open.
Okay, so yeah, I love that answer because yeah, it's about how you are being perceived, right? And that is something you
Yes,
can control and you can work on,
absolutely.
and we can practice.
We can
Yeah.
practice. Yeah. Some of what we looked at too is yes, it's empathy. We sometimes define that differently. So it's about authentic, but also little things you could do with your team is ways that you could build trust. So things like at the end of the week, saying like, hey, let's have let's do a check-in. What did we do well as a team? What did we feel like we missed? What did I do well as a leader? Or is there something that I missed? So having that kind of agreement and check-in to say like, what can we do from a trust perspective that helps us build and strengthen is something that can easily be done, right? And that is empathetic in a way because you're checking in. So it's another version of empathy.
Yeah, and ultimately, we're also all human, right? I think I I remember also working with many people like that, and I wouldn't expect them to change into, for instance, you
Right.
in terms of work style, right?
Yeah.
So it's relative. So
Yes.
somebody reaching out a bit more where you're like, hey, this is a little extra. I feel cared for because I know that that's not normally something they would ask or do. So this is somebody reaching
Mhm.
out. I think we recognize that in others, maybe not when we're complete in emotional turmoil, but generally we recognize this, and it can be relative, right? As you say, it can still be authentic in style. Yeah,
Yeah, we can give
totally.
each other grace. We can understand, like, hey, they're trying. And that trying, when authentic, is even if it's clunky, is way better than just not. We know that that not doing it is going to have terrible results very quickly.
All right. So if we talk about disruption specifically, if if I'm in a fast-paced, growing organization,
Mhm.
um, and I think all of us admit that that trust building is an affliction, or it's like a healthy diet, right? Trust building is something we all perpetually need to work on. It's not necessarily an affliction, but we know, that it
Absolutely.
always needs work, and it always could do with more work. Um, how do I know as a leader that I really need to talk to somebody like you, that maybe I'm starting to get into dangerous territory?
So I think there's a few things. What you said right out of the gate is important. When we're moving really fast in high growth environments, we're sometimes taking shortcuts, or we're moving through. There's too many things on our plate, and so taking the time to step back and really process some of that just sometimes doesn't feel like it's there. So one of the opportunities of obviously partnering with somebody that can be more of a coach has that ability to help focus and slow down. But as a leader, I would say things like, if you're feeling like I'm just pushing information down and I'm not really tailoring it, if it feels like I don't really know what's going on with my team at a personal level, even if I see them coming in and I don't know that they've got something going on, or they're showing up late and I'm not curious about why they're showing up, I'm just going to say, hey, you need to be here on time. That's an issue. That's going to be where the trust is starting to break down. And so those indicators around, people not feeling like they have your back, or you feeling like they're showing up on time, that they're delivering, they're missing deadlines, those are all things that there's going to be some significant trust breakdown happening if they feel like you're not giving them time to ask questions, really try to understand the situation. So I think those are all indicators that there's something to be said. What we found from the biggest trust destroyers were things such as, lack of transparency around uncertainty and the trade-offs that are happening. Thinking about misalignment, perceived misalignment between leadership and what we said we're setting out to do. And then certainly how we handle some of these, implementations around data and AI and things. So if we're moving through those without that care and thinking about how do we actually, how is this going to work for you? What are the implications? What are the implications to customers? And we just are moving through and expecting people to just kind of get on board, that's probably an indicator we need to stop and rethink.
You also briefly touched on AI when we started, right? Which seems to be, it's like with any hot new topic, right? It seems
Yep.
to set people off in all sorts of directions, and everybody has a slightly different piece of the puzzle and level of understanding about the subject. So that typically creates some friction just right off the bat
Yeah.
in that space. Um, how do you see trust in that space with something so new and fast
Yeah.
moving, entering the stage left
Yep.
or right? I'm not sure what the proverbial right side is, but
So, what we found was that it is by far the biggest disruptor, but it's not the biggest trust breaker. So what we found as those biggest trust breakers were those other things I was saying. So if a leader or an organization can come in and say, hey, AI has a future for us. Here's how, or here's how we're going to work with each of our teams to figure out what's the right fit because we know it's unique for the different operating business components we're doing. We want you to come to the table and talk about it with us. Those are the pieces. So we know that, thinking about more thoughtfully, how does it impact and how does it roll out? Thinking about the honest, and open communication, allowing people to give feedback without the retribution, like how is it going? Those are all things that we saw really being a more supportive factor because the reality is AI it is here. I mean, businesses are using it differently, but we're touched by it in anything we do. And so if an organizations have to figure out how do they what's their role with it and how are they going to get people behind it.
yeah. So I'm translating here, but I'm hearing some bridge building, right? Meeting people where they are,
Yep.
allowing people to contribute from the pieces of the AI puzzle that they've gathered so far.
Mhm. How does it work
Um,
inside their specific team? What is it? Where is that loop of feedback around this is what's working? Like that thing you said we need to use doesn't really work for the way we need to get work done. What is that? Allowing place for that kind of conversation and feedback to happen in a really, supportive and open way is really critical.
yeah. Um, I have like a gazillion more questions, but that's not that's not going to happen. One big one though I want to touch upon because um, one of the things that really struck a chord with me because in my corporate career I did 17 years for the same employer and I had over 21 different um, line managers.
Wow.
And you talked about some continuity right there in leadership and as one of the big factors. Unfortunately, in the scenarios that I see, there is typically big turnover or change of people, right? So there's interim leadership, there is loss of key personnel or key leaders that are very often part of these scenarios and part of changes and part of um, considering that it has such a big impact on the trust level. Um, how, I'm assuming you work in these scenarios with people who come
Yeah.
into these organizations where there's a whole legacy and history, and then there is a new face in a very critical position.
Mhm.
Um, we can't go through all of it, but what are some of the main critical success factors for the leadership around that individual, but also maybe for that individual to plan for, take into consideration in that?
Yeah. So, we know that change is constant, right? So, we're not suggesting that we're not going to see this type of thing happening. It's happening all over us all the time. What we want to see is how do we understand what was working? So, trying to figure, instead of coming in and perhaps immediately imposing what we think is right, really starting to figure out like what is working, what's not working. Understanding, does everybody actually have a clear a view of what the vision is and why their work matters? Or are they just kind of being expected to show up and be more or less a cog in a wheel, which is obviously not where we want people to be. And so thinking about what is it that, what's working, not working, what matters, where do they fit? How do they fit in the vision? Do they even understand the vision? Or is that just expected? It's not trickled down the right way. And so trying to figure out when we think about consistency, it's more around how does everybody know what's happening and what direction we're going? And are we all in this agreement that we're going in the same way? I think, with leaders, especially when we hit these executive levels, we almost become immune to some of the conversations we're having because we're having them so often. And yet when that information starts to trickle down into other areas of the organization with other leaders, it can feel very jarring. And we forget that we've been exposed to it on a much more frequent basis. And so we have to bring people along. And a lot of times that is focused on, where have we been, where we are now, and where are we going, and why do we have to go there? And right now, we know that there's a lot of things that need to change in how we're looking at business because of the level of uncertainty. One of the things why we wanted to do this research also was because we felt like we were hearing a lot, not just around trust, but people feel like there was a lot out of their control. And we really believe that people have agency and that there's things we can do as leaders and organizational level leaders too, that we need to then step into and not feel like everything's happening to us. And so that was a big component to kind of bring that back to your question around there's a lot we can do. And it can start with getting curious and trying to figure out where all the pieces are versus us just assuming people aren't wanting to be aligned with what the bigger vision is.
Yeah, very much so, right? You hire people because of what they can do and who they are. You put a lot of effort in that, so you should use it. I would also say that if you hire a fractional or an interim individual, you should have reasonable expectation that they've spent above average time actually practicing what we've talked about today, right?
Yes.
And they've put in above average practice and have above average skills in this space because they are used to coming in temporary as the fresh face. But and what I'm hearing is that if you are moving internally or you're doing a long-term hire, then yes, you need to focus on cultural fit and everything else, but you might also really need to help this individual in this space, which then is a nice natural segue back to you, Kim, and your organization and your business and the Spark Effect. If after listening here, people have more questions, want to work with you, want to find out more about what you do and your team and your organization, where do they go? What do they do?
Absolutely. So they can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect. We also, as you mentioned, have our own podcast called Courage to Advance. Love to have people check that out. And then most importantly, we have free resources we've created specifically for your listeners. And so they can come to the sparkeffect.com/BER for Business Emergency Room and download free resources that actually have a lot of applicable tools for leaders and at the organizational planning level that they can take that utilizes this data and helps them start to think about dashboard planning, team leadership meetings, things that they can really bring forward and really support much of what we discussed today.
That's great. Everybody loves some good freebies, right?
Yes.
I think we all love to do some Dr. Google and self-diagnosis, so to play around with this and get a feel for what's in there. That's a fabulous offer. So thank you very much for that. For those of you that are listening to this, Kim Bohr, Bohr. The Spark Effect is easy enough to spell, so I will stay away from that. Thank you so much, Kim, for bringing this. We could talk for hours on end because yes, trust and disruption. I love that combination. It's all about the people dynamics. So thank you very much for joining the podcast today and sharing.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed our conversation.
And thank you for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. And I would love to have you back here on the next episode. This is it for today. Thank you. Bye. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.